All right, everyone. Who's ready for the second panel? Alrighty, the second panel is titled The Battle for the Soul of the Democratic Party. And it will be moderated by Piper Winkler and Christian Tabash. Piper is a junior at Harvard College, majoring in comparative literature and an organizer with Harvard for Bernie. Christian is a junior at Harvard College, majoring in government and an organizer with both Harvard for Bernie and the Palestine Solidarity Committee. And now for our panelists. Michael Brooks. Michael Brooks is a leftist journalist and the host of the YouTube program, The Michael Brooks Show. His writing appears in Jacobin, and he co-hosts award-winning political talk show, The Majority Report, and is a co-host of the podcast, Woke Bros. There we go. Dr. Cornel West. Dr. Cornel West is a political activist, public intellectual, and professor of the practice of public philosophy at Harvard University and professor emeritus at Princeton University. He has written over 20 books, has produced 3 spoken word albums, and is also a campaign co-chair for the Bernie Sanders 2020 campaign. Esha Krishnaswamy is a lawyer and podcast host interested in the economic analysis of law, especially modern monetary theory. Her podcast historically attempts to decolonize history. Her writing has been published in Fair, among other progressive media. Philip Agnew is an organizer, activist, artist, and cultural critic who has been recognized by The Root as one of the 100 most influential African Americans in the nation. Currently, he is a board member for the Planned Parenthood Action Fund and is a campaign surrogate for Bernie Sanders. Oh, wait. There we go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. What an honor it is for us to be moderating this incredible panel of prominent progressives. We want to start off with a question to each of you, so we'd love to get your individual answers on this. What does invoking the soul of the Democratic Party, in your view, actually represent? Oh, please, yes.
Well, I think when we evoke a word like soul, it makes me think of how we talk about religion, actually. And I'm a believer that, well, not necessarily a believer, but I'm a believer that religion is a fungible thing, and that spirituality and belief manifest in a variety of different ways, so that people who are religious have led some of the most courageous, dynamic, unparalleled movements of physical courage in human history. And also religion can be a vehicle of some of the most repressive, toxic, and cruel ideologies imaginable. So I think the soul of the Democratic Party is in some respects what we choose it to be. Is it Bill Clinton? Or is it, you know, Fannie Lou Hamer? Right? These are both parts of the soul of the political party in this country that is the potential vehicle of labor, of the left, of justice, of love, of dignity, and so on. So I choose to have a certain vision of the Democratic Party because I want to make that enacted and real in the world. So I think we have to, and that is why it's important. For all of the flaws and all of the complexities, we need to own the FDR traditions to the ways in which it was liberatory. We need to connect it, obviously, with people like Debs or Lincoln who weren't Democrats, and I think we need to globalize it. I think I just came back from interviewing President Lula in Brazil. That's the soul of the Democratic Party that I want. And so I think that's what we're trying to do. I think we're trying to, this fight is not only material, it's ideological, and it's for a certain ethic. And on the left, we're not necessarily comfortable with talking like that, but you put it in the question, so there it is.
Absolutely. Of course, I just want to salute the visionary leaders who put this together, and Sister Piper's words were just so powerful.
Oh.
So I know her beloved mother is here somewhere, though. Just wave your hand, Mom. Raise your hand. Raise your hand. Where are you? Oh, I see. And Brother Christian, good God, the work you do is just so magnificent. Making the connection between radical democracy at home and acknowledging the humanity of folk who are often so subordinated, are occupied, are dominated, and so forth. And Brother Mike, I know your mother's here too.
Yes.
The moms are special.
Oh.
Moms are special. I'm old school about that, though. Absolutely. My beloved daughter's here too, and she's special too.
I just don't want people bothering my mom. You know?
No, she don't mind being bothered, though. She's proud of you, though, brother. But no, for me, you see, soul is a very, very difficult term to come to terms with, because I come from a soulful people. Mm-hmm. You see, and soul is always about when you're hated, you love back, you terrorize, you fight for freedom of everybody. It's the sharing and soothing of a sweetness, a painful truth, and a vision of transforming the world in which you live. You see, that's Stevie Wonder.
Oh, wow.
You see, that's true. That's John Coltrane.
Yeah.
That's Mary Lou Williams. That's Sarah Vaughan. That's Aretha Franklin. So soul is a very dangerous term. And Martin Luther King Jr., when he formed his first organization, what was it called? The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to do what? Redeem the soul of America. And Malcolm X said, America ain't got no soul. So you can't talk about one without the other. So the soul of the Democratic Party, what kind of painful truths are they telling? What kind of visions do they have of transforming the world? What kind of soothing sweetness? And sweetness is not some sentimental sentiment. It's Sappho. It's bittersweet. And bittersweet's about love, and love will turn your world upside down if you got the real thing. You see, that's what it is. Come from a soulful people, so that the love is crucial in terms of what it looks like in the public sphere. Justice, what it looks in the private sphere. Tenderness, you see. So in that way, the soul of the Democratic Party today, corporatized, commodified, tied to Wall Street, tied to big military, tied to denial when it comes to ecological catastrophe in a serious way, and then want to act as if they're progressive for a few weeks as they move back into a less soulful condition. And so when somebody like Bernie Sanders come along, you say, oh, we got this secular Jewish brother from Brooklyn who made his way to Vermont. Now, what kind of painful truths is he telling? What kind of soothing sweetness in the form of solidarity is he not just talking about enacting over time? What kind of visions that he has for fundamental transformation? And we have to be very honest about this, that, Brother Bernie's not running on a socialist platform.
Come on.
I've been a socialist for 52 years. Yep. And I take a bullet for Bernie. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily in the heart, that's for Mom, but right over here. That's that Bernie zone right there. Oh, yeah. Oh, yes, I'll take it. But he's not running on the socialist platform, but he's running connected to a movement that is so progressively oriented, that is leading toward the empowerment of poor and working people. And in that way, the soul of the Democratic Party, in which our dear brother Bernie is now fighting with us, becomes so much, and everything is at stake in terms of the prospects for this very fragile experiment in democracy against its imperial backdrop, at present and past.
Well, can you hear me? Okay. So just so you know, climate disaster is impending, and for a lot of you, it may be abstract, but let me help you see what the future is. How many of you have seen the movie The Purge? It's going to be like that, but that's going to be in real life. So in 2005, when we had Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, a wealthy suburb of like white people gathered together. They barricaded their neighborhood so no one could evacuate, and then they brought out all these weapons arsenals to patrol the neighborhood. One of them walked up to their black neighbor, Mr. Bell, who was just sitting on his front porch, and they put a gun in front of his head and said, "We do not serve your kind here." Later, Mr. Bell testified that there was no electricity, no police, no nothing. We were just sitting ducks. On top of this vigilante militia ended up shooting another black neighbor who was babysitting his teenage nephews in the back as a way of stopping looters. And instead of mobilizing the first response to assist the citizens of New Orleans, the Democratic governor, Kathleen Blanco, Democratic governor, by the way, ordered the police and troops to shoot to kill. Her exact words were, "These troops know how to shoot and kill, and they're more than willing to do so." In the Superdome, people who couldn't evacuate, the elderly, the poor, and the disabled huddled there. The federal government did not send food, water, or medicine, and many died of dehydration and pneumonia. Now, instead of the city of New Orleans, imagine the entire country of Bangladesh underwater with 100 million people. You think Bangladesh is safe from US violence? Think again. In 2003, the 9/11 Commission reported, 9/11 has taught us that terrorism against Americans over there should be regarded just as we regard terrorism against Americans over here. In this same sense, the American homeland is the planet. US-style border guards have been deployed in Colombia, Kenya, Thailand, Turkey, Estonia, just to name a few countries. Michael Flynn in 2003 said, US border control efforts have undergone a dramatic metamorphosis in recent years, as the United States has attempted to implement practices aimed at stopping migrants long before they reach the US shores. We have seen weapons expos featuring all these defense contractors where they advertise drones that automatically kill people who get too close to the border. At this point, we're not talking about the soul of the Democratic Party. We're talking about whether or not we have a soul. So now we have a right-wing regime set up. We're going to accelerate climate change, and we'll be literally setting up billions of people for mass slaughter. The great socialist Rosa Luxemburg once said, "There's a time when civilization is at a crossroads. It's either socialism or we revert to barbarism, and it's our choice."
I too want to thank you all for having me. It's a real honor to be on a panel with heroes and peer heroes and to follow a panel of people that I look up to. I came because of y'all, I figured we would drink after this, and truthfully, I agree with what has been said. It's really hard to come after that, not just because it's true. It's just it is fact. It is indisputable that we are fighting for the soul of not only the Democratic Party but the soul of the country and the nation. And so, when we talk about the soul of the Democratic Party, I think when we look in a historical context, we can say that there have been times where the Democratic Party has had the what right. So the health care for all, there was a New Deal, there was a level of understanding that we needed to do certain things to alleviate the economic ills of people. We needed to embrace unions. We've talked about that before. We needed massive infrastructure improvements and to put this country to work. We need to make sure that wages are fair, make sure that people aren't working 7 days a week all day. So the what has been there before. But when we look at the soul of the Democratic Party in the country, I think we need to look at the why, the when, the where, and the who. And that is where, when we look at the autopsy of the party, that is where I think we will find the soul of it and where it will go. So when we talk about the why, we've had the what there, but the what has been because it will cost less.
Right.
There's been a neoliberal agenda that supported that because it may save the country, because we may lose an election if we don't do that. The what was there, but the why was always wrong. And when we talk about the soul of the Democratic Party and what it will be, we need to do those things, but it is not because it costs less, because it is politically expedient, but because we believe in the humanity of people. And that is something that is, no matter what administration we have, that is something that will last beyond an administration. And that's when we talk about the soul, it is immortal, right? And so in order to have a soul, the why needs to be attached to human beings and the morality and the deep moral and just cause of the party. So we can have the what correct and still have the why incorrect. It could still be tied to a neoliberal agenda, and that is like the chaff which the wind bloweth away. It will be deceased, right? And so when we look at the why, we have to examine that for the soul. When we talk about the where, we've had the what correct, but many times it's been about a domestic thing. There's not been an internationalist thing. Where do we think people deserve to have health care, housing, water, right? So we could have the what correct as a Democratic Party, but if we don't have the where correct, right? Is it here and in Haiti? Is it here in Palestine? Is it here and in South Africa, here and in South America? Is it those places as well? That's when we look at the soul of this party. When we look at the who, is it just for tradesmen, right? Are unions just for white men? Is housing, is cars, are economic uplift just for people who have come back from war who are white, right? Is middle class just for white people? So the who is important when we look at the soul of the country. And I think the when is important. We don't need incremental things. These are not things we're talking about as generational. Hillel says, if not now, when? And so when we talk about the level of urgency that the Democratic Party has had in times before, that level of urgency has been woefully insufficient to the material needs of the people in this room and the people around the world. And so we've got to look at, for the soul, in my opinion, for us to examine whether we have a soul and whether we will have a soul is whether we're willing to engage with not just the what. The policy is good. I believe in I'll take a rubber bullet. I'll get a punt. yeah, right here, right. But I agree. I wouldn't be a part of this movement to elect Senator Sanders if I thought it was exercise of futility. But the what is good, but it is the why. It is the when, it's the where.
Brother West, thank you all so much for being here. Brother West, you mentioned the dichotomy between MLK and Malcolm X, whether we do have a soul. That's a common theme in your responses. And so, as a follow-up, we've mentioned the influence of the fossil fuel industry, of the pharmaceutical industry, of the military-industrial complex, the prison-industrial complex, in the Democratic Party. So, can you speak to how there are different theories between the Democratic Party establishment and the theories of change of the labor movements and those from the outside? And as a follow-up to that, what worldview do they envision? And I'll leave it at that for now.
Wow, that's a whole lot there, though, bro.
How about you start with that, Dr. West?
Wow. I mean, part of our problem is that we have to be able to think of the United States as both an empire full of greed, avarice, obsessed with power and domination, and also a fragile experiment in democracy. So we keep track of our indigenous peoples. We keep track of how you get from 13 to 50 states. You keep track of the Philippines and Hawaii and Samoa and so forth. And that's what we've been. We've been an empire. But we had courageous, visionary human beings that tried to get democratic experiments off the ground. And democracies have souls. Empires don't have souls. See, when Malcolm X saw America, he saw an empire. He saw hatred, greed, contempt across the board. And you can look at America and see that. What we love about Howard Zinn, and that's one reason why we had this interview in Boston Review this week. It was 10 years ago, just on Monday that he passed. Oh. That his story is about both the greed and the critique of the greed. It's those socialists at Harvard in 1912. Now we know it wasn't a mass movement. We could probably all foot him in the bathroom. But that's all right. From them came W.B. Du Bois. From them came F.O. Matheson, the great socialist who's master of Eliot House, author of American Renaissance. Here comes Ralph Nader from Harvard Law. Here comes Edward Zaid from Harvard PhD. So there are these other persons who are talking about renewing democracy in its most fundamental way that could deal with empire, white supremacy, male supremacy, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-Mexican sensibilities, mechanisms of accountability of the most powerful at the top. Yeah. And right now, unfortunately, the corporate wing of the Democratic Party, which is still dominant. That's why they fear Brother Bernie so. And they're going to come up with every possible strategy and tactic. We saw it 4 years ago. It's even more intense now. Yep. And we just have to be fortified. But we got to be fortified morally. And I'm a revolutionary Christian, so we got to get fortified spiritually. Not to fall into the hatred and the greed that they're going to be manifesting, but we got to be warriors. Got to be willing to swing now. Don't mean a thing if they ain't got that swing. I mean, you got to be willing to swing now. There ain't no doubt about that. Very much so. But you got both this imperial side, democratic side, the democratic side getting weaker and weaker until here comes Occupy. Here comes Black Lives Matter. Here comes Bernie's campaign and the movement behind it. Those are signs of great hope. But hope always a verb, not just a virtue. The hope is in the motion. The hope is in the sacrifice. The hope is in the truth-telling. The hope is in the justice-seeking. And to the degree we have large numbers of folk who are willing to do that, then, in fact, we have some real possibility of a soul in a democratic project. We never fetishize any party, right, especially a party of the power elite. Never fetishize it.
I just want to add that thank you, and it's an immense honor to be here, including definitely with Dr. West, who is an influence on me. And one of the major reasons that he's an influence on me is because of that synthesis and the ability to hold multiple truths, that we have to have some sense of a capacity here to do something with democracy, and then also not lie and deceive ourselves about what we are and what capitalism is and what empire is. I came across a speech fragment from Martin Luther King Jr. recently, which I played on my show, and I don't know where or the title of the speech, but I thought it was so important because we've put a lot of work, and we still have to put work into reminding everybody that the man was on the left. He wasn't a guy who came out once a year and said everybody should treat each other nicely. He was a serious... But the other thing that I loved about this speech, which was he talked about the fallacy that certain Christians misunderstood love as a seeding of power. And then Nietzsche came along and rejected Christian morality because he thought it was denying someone's vitality, the will to power in a healthy sense. And he said, love without power is sentimental and anemic, and power without love is abusive and corrosive. I'm paraphrasing. And that was when I saw it, I thought, well, here, okay, we know the left wing Dr. King. Well, here's the Machiavellian Dr. King, and I love it. I want the left to have Machiavelli so that we can have the strategy, the ruthlessness, the clarity to actually win these battles and be ruthless with institutions. And then I want us to learn how to be really kind to each other, welcoming of a broad set, and actually have a movement that has the capacity to do that. That's why the cancel stuff is relevant that Katie brought up, because it's a stand-in for this eliminationism of other humans, which is neoliberalism enacted. And it's also a contradiction from when we get utopian. It's beautiful. We're the people who sit around and we say, why don't we have a world where there's no prisons? Okay. That's a radical fucking statement. That's a real thing, and we should take it seriously. But then, on the other hand, oh, well, these people could never be part of our coalition because they made a mistake or said something. Like, it's a contradiction in what we're enacting. So what I get that I hope is in the realm of answering your question from this Dr. King clip was left-wing, spiritual, but also with a vision of power. And if we can synthesize those things, I think we will speak to the highest impulses of this country, we will be welcoming to people, and we will win.
Know when to hold them, when to fold them. I know you got more questions on there. I fully agree. I could pontificate, but yeah.
Isha, would you like to jump in here?
Sure. Let me just remind you of how the Democratic establishment thinks. So most of you probably are too young to remember, but in 2009, President Obama said, a few weeks ago, you joined together with hospitals, labor unions, insurers, medical device manufacturers, drug companies to hammer out a deal. That's like inviting 5 wolves, 1 sheep to discuss the dinner menu, and obviously the sheep will get slaughtered. So in 2008, an entire month, October 2008, an entire month before the election where the Democratic people won 257 seats in the House and 59 seats in the Senate, John McDonough, I believe he works at Harvard, but I hope he's not here. He was an advisor to Senator Ted Kennedy, and he had a group called Workhorse Group. This is what he wrote in his book. At the table were representatives of consumers, disease advocacy, business, insurance, physicians, hospital, labor, pharmaceuticals. Some of the chiefs there were Chip Kahn of the Federation of American Hospitals. He ran attack ads against whatever Bill Clinton's healthcare plan was. The trade group, for-profit hospitals, Karen Inyani, the president of American Health Insurance Plan, a leading consumer advocacy group, and others were represented by staffers and lobbyists. So then, like in October 2008, they got a little room together, and they talked about single payer, Romney Care, and some third option. And so John McDonough asked people in the room to raise their hands, like, who wants single payer? No one raised their hands, and single payer was killed an entire month before the election because they do not understand class conflicts. Actually, Jesus was the first person to do the class conflicts when he said, you can't have serve 2 masters or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So you can't you can't negotiate between the big pharma. You need somebody willing to have the people and say, go away, big pharma. We're going to nationalize our health care. And that's the main difference between the labor movement and the Democratic establishment.
Wonderful.
Yeah. I'll just say one thing really quickly. Democracy is a great experiment, and I think both Labor and the Democratic Party have a lot to learn about democracy and what it looks like and what it feels like. And what I mean is, I think some of our best social movement organizations have done really well at transforming people from objects to subjects, right? Working alongside people to confirm what they already know, to bring them into the body politic, give them the opportunity to not see themselves as people upon whom history happens, but people who make history happen, right? Actors in their lives and not spectators in their lives. And to me, that is a deep core element of what true democracy is. It's very scary, it's very volatile, it's very it's not controllable in a lot of ways.
That's right.
Because you are allowing space for people to have the agency to make mistakes, but for the credit, the blame, all of the messiness to be spread about the entire body politic. And so I think both labor, I wouldn't put them, I think a lot of our institutions have a lot to learn about what democracy looks like. And, you can't, one thing I always say, you can't raise a kid, for 18 years of their life and say, no, grown folks talking. No, leave the room. No, you don't get to decide. No, my way or the highway. And then at 18, miraculously expect them to engage in the political process as full actors. And so in our organizations, in our families, in our churches, we've got to figure out actually how to build up a democracy from the bottom, and that will then be reflected in labor. I don't see that often in labor organizations. I think, we can talk ad nauseum about the drawbacks and some of the great work that labor is doing currently, but that's real democracy, and I think that's what we've got to take from social movements. Some of the best organizations, the black feminist organizations, the black radical tradition is steeped in that, and then when we do that, that's when we'll start to see a democracy, a Democratic Party that's able to hold disagreement, that's able to handle dissent, that's able to expand their borders and see someone who has a different opinion as something that enhances the body and not something that atrophies it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, panelists. I want to return to something that Esha said because I think it is so apt, talking about this 5 wolves, 1 sheep kind of setup. And I think it ties very nicely into something Michael has brought up as well, which is strategy. So let's talk strategy. Within the current Democratic Party, there exists a really stark dichotomy between candidates who support top-down, technocratic, structural change, and a candidate...
Big.
Structural. And a candidate that demands nothing short of a political revolution that will work for working people. Now, I've gotten into this a little bit, but I want to hear from you. Who do these ideologies serve, and what will their effects be?
The big structural change ideologies.
Exactly. So I'd love to hear us start with that, and then to talk as well about who the working people's revolution is working for as well.
You know, from my stance, without talking too much about specific candidates, a notion of big structural change, or even a notion that says, I have a plan that I'm ready to present for each and everything, and this is not shade or anything, right? You know, business, corporations, they hate volatility. They hate the notion that tomorrow will be unpredictable. They are risk averse. And so I think sometimes language like that is a really bald-faced appeal to say that there will be change, big structural change, but I'm going to tell you what it's going to look like. And it's going to look exactly like this, and these are what the repercussions and ramifications are going to be so that you can predict for this impending volatility. And what a people's revolution signals is that there will be a lack of predictability for the foreseeable future for those that crave it, right? And for me, what a political revolution signals is kind of what I was talking about earlier. I don't have to belabor it. It is we are opening up the doors for an activation of people to participate fully in the process, right? And there are some things that we know will happen because I've created policies that reflect what will happen. But there's a great deal about what this country will look like that we do not know, and we cannot imagine what it will look like. And that is the space where the people in this room will be the crafters of that. And that is scary. But I think that is the key difference between how people talk about what they are saying. They are not the same. We are not just asking for big structural change. We're asking for an upending of the very foundation of everything. And that is scary for a lot of people, including a lot of people if you're really knocking on doors, right? If you're really talking to people at barbershop, that is very scary. Poor people are risk averse. Black people are risk averse. Women are risk averse because we cannot afford to take risks. And so I think that, you know, there's a part there where we have to say, this is what it will look like. Medicare for all, education for all, the ability to go to a medical health care provider, a mental health care provider, ability to have food, water. Those are some of the things that we can say, but there's a great many things that we do not know what it will look like because that is to be written.
Absolutely. I think one of the real challenges here is not just the critique of neoliberalism and all of its various forms, but the ways in which mainstream streamlined discourses tends to devalue and demean what the fundamental aims of something like the Bernie Sanders campaign is about. So when they say it's fundamental structural change, that's an abstraction.
Yes.
Yes.
We want to make sure poor and working people are treated in such a way they have decency and dignity. We want to abolish poverty.
Yeah.
That's what the aim is. All this structural change. Structural change. A lot of times that structural change talk is just making liberals and progressives sound so revolutionary when they're not as revolutionary as they think they are.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? So that the issue becomes, you know, any justice that's only justice soon degenerates into something less than justice. You got to come to what underlies it all, right? We don't want poor people in any color. We want workers to have control over their destiny. We want to make sure women are treated with dignity so that patriarchy is called into question. We want to make sure the vicious legacy of white supremacy is confronted and we attempt to wipe it out no matter how difficult it is. We want to make sure that people in Libya, in Palestine, in Tel Aviv, in Guatemala, and others are treated with dignity, which means we abolish occupation, we abolish poverty, abolish the kind of class exploitation, abolish patriarchal, homophobic, right across the top. Oh, you're a visionary. You don't say. You don't say. That's right. That's right. But so what? So what? So what? But it's the end of it. Because if you just start talking about big structural change, that's exactly how corporate media likes to trot it out. Oh, Bernie, you want to turn everything upside down. You're going to create chaos. And all Bernie says is, go to the hood. Yep. And you're going to see things upside down, chaotic, people suffering. Go to the barrio. Go to the reservation. Go to poor communities in Appalachia. Go to working class communities everywhere. Things are already turned upside down. The suffering's already there. Don't put the burden on me. Don't put it on me. It's on you. The burden's on you. That's what we're talking about.
Well, I'd like to say that today we're at Harvard, and none of us are worried about a drone strike killing all of us. Right. And that is something that most of the world cannot, do not have that luxury. Drones have killed weddings, we've droned weddings, whatnot. So what I noticed with the structural change is that it sounds a lot more like the IMF structural adjustment. That's where, so that's where you basically go and say, hey, we're gonna, you either have a choice, here's the US military, you can privatize and sell all of the water and all the assets and enact austerity, or you're gonna get, I don't know, cooed. Is that a verb? I don't know. Okay.
It is now.
Okay. No, it's a verb. So I see that, okay, I'm just going to name names. I see that Senator Warren often falls into line of the U.S. empire. She, like at Pod Save America, she called him President Guaido. Who elected him? 0 people. She has praised Netanyahu before. And so she falls into all the empire propaganda. And for me, it made a big difference when I saw Senator Bernie Sanders, when they asked him, do you think Juan Guaido is the legitimate president of Venezuela? He said no. And that to me is the difference, is one buys into the empire propaganda and the other does not.
And we should note, just to affirm this as a footnote, that when they asked my dear sister Elizabeth Warren, who is my beloved colleague, who's your favorite president?
Ooh, structural adjustment coming.
Over and over again, Theodore Roosevelt. You said, Theodore Roosevelt, imperial to the core, deeply white supremacy. He had a wonderful critique of corporations in the context of ugly forms of imperial subordination and white supremacy. Is that the legacy you're talking about? She hasn't been challenged on that, but she needs to, because the very fact that she would say that means she's coming out of this particular kind of milquetoast progressivism. That's really what it is.
Yeah.
And today, it's a progressivism that is concerned when the middle class has to wrestle with bankruptcy laws. When the middle class seems to have to deal with economic insecurity. So I'm a Christian. I love everybody. I love the middle class, but I don't start with the bourgeoisie. I start with poor people. I start with working people. It's a different lens through which you look at the world. We're not out to dehumanize anybody, but Sister Elizabeth, who was a Republican until 1996, right? That she makes a move as a progressive. We welcome her. I like conversion. We welcome her into the progressive camp. But we say, what kind of relics are at work that still provide blinders when it comes to a full-fledged progressive vision? And that's the kind of challenge that Brother Bernie has vis-a-vis Sister Elizabeth. And we can have that debate respectfully, but also intensely, honestly, candidly. because Elizabeth Warren could easily become so quickly hijacked and co-opted, just like Obama was. And that's the last thing we want. That's the last thing we want.
I'm gonna add to the shade just a little bit. The shade has started.
Eclipse.
So I think, I'm very clippable on Elizabeth Warren content. There's no third way for me. But, I mean, structural adjustment, she did say her most favorite foreign leader was Angela Merkel, and I understand why she would say that. Ooh. Yep. But I'm also quite aware of what she did to Greece. And we really need to be, I think this is so important. Just three quick things to follow up on. The foreign policy needs to be synchronized with the domestic. It's not an afterthought. It's not, oh, I'm concerned about that on the weekends or all of that. It's synchronized.
Chickens come home to roost.
It's moral, economic, and political synchronization. Yes, they come home to roost. Also, in the language, I'll reference Lula again. Lula said, he said, look, in response to a journalist, not me, I asked him good questions. They lifted 40 million people out of poverty. They said, why didn't you do more on infrastructure? Which, first he did. But he said, look, if poor people ate cement, that would have been the number one priority. My number one priority was food, because people didn't have food. And third, on a tactical level, there is a core contradiction in her campaign specifically, because the candidates on the right are saying, we're just going to do the same thing. Put us into office, we'll protect you from Trump, whatever, go get the hell out of the way. She's saying, I'm going to do something that is fundamentally transformative by the same rules at which the other people do the center-right platform, which will fail in both regards. It will fail on an inside track because it's enough of a challenge in certain areas to annoy people, and it is timid and narrow and not democratic enough to actually engage a movement to even have a prayer of passing those things. And that's why Bernie's campaign is synchronized between the policy and the movement.
Thank you so much. We just have a few more minutes with our questions, then we want to transition to the audience. So with that, we're going to lay down a few, and you guys can kind of pick and choose which ones you'd like to respond to. In the previous panel, the previous wonderful panel, we heard about how youth were vilified for voting for Jill Stein, and they were blamed for the results of the election. And so the question is, before this election cycle even started, vote blue no matter what was such a prevalent and persistent message, and it seemed to be the model that voters were set on, and it was the approach to the election. So in your opinion, why is that mindset so persistent, and why is it so widespread? That's number one. Two, who is the Democratic leadership, specifically the DNC, accountable to? And how does its approach affect American democracy on the whole? Do you want to throw in?
Let's keep it with those two questions. I'm sure you all have a lot to say on this topic.
I think there's a quote from, I always forget the author, I apologize. I'm the master of decent halfway quotes and not remembering who to attribute them to. But it's good. It's from a writer from Mozambique, I know that. And he said that when the people are terrified, they elect monsters to protect them.
It's from Lula, right?
And that was quoted by him.
Oh,
it's a writer, Mia, I forget his name. Regardless, I think that you have to be, sorry?
Mia Kotu.
Mia Kotu, thank you. That's
there
what
it is.
And so I think that explains, obviously, the rise of these monsters across the globe, Trump and Bolsonaro and all of these various leaders. But I think it also, in a way that I want to have a compassion and attentiveness for. There's a bunch of people like Hillary Clinton, I have no doubt, she's more angry at Bernie Sanders than Donald Trump. She doesn't care about the results of this election. There is a power elite inside the Democratic Party, which links to your second question, that I have no doubt is more threatened by Bernie Sanders than Donald Trump. That's clear.
Yeah.
For the people that, as an example, you mentioned, Philip, I think that people are rightfully petrified that some game show asshole is putting children in concentration camps.
Yep. Yep.
And they want to do anything they can to remove him. And so how we enlarge the conversation, at this point we're in a really interesting moment because I think actually legitimately Bernie is the safe bet. He is the smartest tactical choice to go up against Trump. But depending on who you're talking to, you need to disaggregate. There are cynical people who have bad faith motives, the same people that, yes, the DNC being controlled by these interests is a disaster for poor people, for working people, and for democracy. And they have bad faith, and they need that. That's the Machiavelli part I keep talking about. They need to just be gone after, hard and strategically. For normal human beings, whoever they may be, that are appalled, and maybe they weren't as conscious. You know, I think there's some people on the left that have a little bit of like early adopter effect. Like, oh, really? You're shocked by that? I knew that this was terrible. But you need to bring them in, and you need to have a real empathy, not for the cynical stuff you see in media, but for the genuine, natural human sentiment of people who are maybe just tuning into that and go, oh my God, what is happening here? And so I don't know the right tactics. I just know that you need to be very clear about who you're talking to, because you're going to get that sentiment from the most cynical people imaginable, and also from some of the most open-hearted, sincere, and genuinely morally motivated people imaginable. And you need to respond, obviously, in diametrically different ways.
Let me just say a quick word about my dear sister, Jill Stein, because I don't think she's fully understood. You know, she's a distinguished graduate of this institution, very much like Helen Keller, one of the great democratic socialists of the 20th century. Both of them graduates of a ruling class site, Harvard University. Which means what? Which means that they had to not just cut radically against the grain, but they resisted the three pillars of professionalism and incorporation at the top, which is conformity, complacency to the suffering of the weak, and cowardliness when it comes to standing for the vulnerable. And so what we have in the Democratic Party in some ways is the crystallization of smartness and monies and drone dropping, because that's smart.
Yeah.
Ain't got nothing to do with wisdom, ain't got nothing to do with compassion, it's just smart. And the self-conception of graduates of the Harvards and Princetons and others, even though Princeton's got Norman Thomas, let us not forget, one of the great socialists of the 20th century. But he had to do the same thing. How do you resist the dominant tilt of your professional chattering classes to be so smart and rich that they're willing to capitulate, not just to a neoliberalism of the last 40 years, they could capitulate to neo-fascism under certain conditions. Yep. That's what's dangerous about it. That's why so much is at stake, you see. Because as long as they just believe life is about being successful and well-adjusted to injustice and well-adapted to indifference toward the vulnerable, that's how you get neo-fascism. So there's a lot of people following Brother Trump that hate his guts, but they love his policies and they're willing to go with it. They know he's a gangster. They talk about him all the time. But when they look at a movement that has to do with poor and working people, trying to be black people together, brown people together, yellow people together, white people together, Jews across the board, Palestinians, all in the same movement, what is Bernie doing? He's creating the conditions that could call our world into question. So they go with a gangster. That's a serious issue. That could be a moment where we are right now. I didn't get to Jill, but she was just an example as somebody who cuts against the grain. You can disagree with her all the way, but one thing about Sister Jill is she is not a conformist when it comes to the status quo. And that's what I love about that sister, even though I don't agree with everything. Absolutely.
Well, I think we should turn the question around and ask if the Democratic establishment is actually willing to vote blue no matter who, because Joe Manchin has said he would vote for Trump. Hillary Clinton too. So I think the framing.
She'll write in
I
Jeffrey
reject
Epstein.
the framing of this question.
Oh, shit.
With a Ghislaine Maxwell as VP, a strong, get things done, smart ticket.
And Weinstein.
And Weinstein. Oh, yeah, Weinstein for commerce.
That's a profound question, though.
I mean, it's been answered. I do want to, because it doesn't seem that we're going to get to it. I wanted to pull a question. You talked about the youth vote. I wanted to pull a question from the previous panel, and, you know, who's got questions for my answers? So I wanted to pull something, and it's about identity politics, and I think I would be doing a disservice to myself and the tree from which I grow if I didn't make one thing clear. It seems as if too often we conflate a perversion of identity politics with what identity politics is and where it came from. Barbara Smith, the Combahee River Collective, Audre Lorde, Barbara Smith, who has endorsed our Senator Sanders, right?
That's right.
Is the person one of the first people to coin that phrase. And what it talked about is that my identity allows me to move in the world or restricts me from moving in the world in certain ways, right? And that the oppressions, the twin, quadruple oppressions that we all face are exhibited and are expressed and are felt differently as a black woman, as a lesbian, as a queer person, as a black man. That oppression doesn't always look the same. The wellspring of what identity politics in the tradition of the Combahee River Collective is talking about is deeply embedded in a black, radical, feminist, socialist agenda that says we need all of us, we need to come to the table. It doesn't look the same. The thing that brought us to the table does not look the same. Your poverty is a little different than my poverty. Your harassment, your assault is different than mine. But we are at this table, and it's because of those differences that our movement has the colors and the beauty and the representations that it has. That is what identity politics is. The perversion of identity politics is a version of representation, right? That capitalists have said that one of you, and because you are one of you, and now you're at the table with us, that all of you all should shut up. Because Jay-Z is on the cover of the magazine with Warren Buffett. That means that you all have made it, right? Or that sectarianism, that because you are a group of blank, you all only care for your interests. That is not what identity politics was, and it is being expressed and discussed as representation or a perversion of an identity politic. And so when the Democratic Party is repulsed by a perversion of identity politic, it tricks us into then championing, no, we're not for identity politics. The trueness of identity politics is rooted in a black radical, black feminist, black socialist tradition that says that all of us are needed at the table, and we come to the table because maybe slightly different reasons, right? But we have to acknowledge those reasons, not as a detriment or an impediment, but as a reason, as an exciting development in our movement when we come together. So I just wanted to talk about it's being weaponized, but that is not being weaponized. A perversion of it is being weaponized, and we're also just talking about representation sometimes.
May I make a comment?
Very important. So there are neoliberal versions of identity politics.
Yes.
Which are hegemonic in the Democratic Party.
Yes.
Yep.
There are democratic socialist versions or revolutionary versions, which the Democratic Party establishment is highly fearful of.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
But in the end, back to solidarity.
Right.
See, solidarity is like a jazz orchestra, not a military band.
Yes.
Everybody's got to raise their voices, bouncing up against those other voices, recognizing that the aim is to increase the collective performance without losing sight of the specificity of who we are. Not just as groups, but as individuals. Most of us have multiple identities inside our own souls.
Yes.
We haven't even got outside of your ego yet, let alone Thanksgiving dinner. All kind of identities bouncing up against each other. But the question is, in the end, what is the moral content?
Yes.
What's the spiritual quality of who you are as a human being? What kind of political consequences will flow? Will it accent what the Hebrew scripture was about in terms of the steadfast love for the orphan, widow, fatherless, motherless, poor, persecuted, subjugated, and oppressed. And then the analysis of empire, of capitalism, of any form of domination. We had communist projects that were full of domination, full of regimentation, you see. We don't know of any human social system that has been in some sense shot through with domination. But radical democracy is always a cure for less democracy if we can awaken in such a way that we're willing to come together in the name of that large solidarity Sister Piper was talking about.
So I'm so glad Dr. West said that, because this is one of the most powerful quotes I've read, and it just like literally changed my attitude. Henry Winston, who was a labor activist and the president of the CPUSA, in his book Strategy for a Black Agenda, said this: "Oppressors are never divided by color. World imperialism is the main enemy with its strongest base in Washington and Wall Street. But the imperial enemy and its allies and collaborators come in many colors. Imperialism is headquartered in Tokyo, as well as Washington, London, Bonn, Paris, Lisbon, and Pretoria. The betrayers of the people, whether in the Sudan or the Congo, Ghana, Vietnam, Guatemala, Bolivia, Paraguay, Pakistan, Philippines, or Guyana, come in all colors. Oppressors themselves are never divided by color. They compete and make war against each other with the lives of the people for the right to dominate and exploit. Among themselves are the US, British, French, Italian, German, Japanese, Belgian, Dutch, and South African imperials are colorblind. Likewise, they are likewise colorblind when it comes to bribing and manipulating the people's betrayers in Asia, Africa, and America. These colorblind monopolists exploit differences to blind the oppressed to their common class interest." And you can see that, like, Trump claims that he hates Muslims, but he loves Mohammed bin Salman. Yeah, and you see Modi hanging out with Trump. And so the oppressed should not divide themselves by color. And the way the Democratic Party uses identity politics, it's always been to shield those in power, but never to analyze what's wrong with the weak. Not what's wrong with the weak, but how the society has failed the weak.
Yeah.
They would say you're silencing MBS's perspective.
Thomas Friedman's there.
No, but I think Winston, he goes a little bit too far. You know, I knew Brother Henry. He's a good communist brother. He's a good communist, just like Ben Davis, one of those distinguished graduates of Harvard Law, who was the most famous black communist of his day, the first black city councilman from Harlem. He went to jail, was under the Smith Act, when he was elected in the 1950s under McCarthyism. You see, so he and Paul Sweezy, all these folk come out of Harvard, who were socialists, Marxists, and so forth. But when he says the oppressed and oppressor never is divided by color, even Henry, you know, he from Jim Crow. He was funny. He knew that there's certain axes in which there is a certain kind of unity. It's just that the capitalism and imperialism is still operating, and they're able to mobilize folk in that way. And the same would be true in terms of patriarchy. There are circumstances under which the men are united because of their toxic, tyrannical masculinities vis-a-vis women. See, then we can acknowledge that even as we have an analysis of capitalism. So we love Winston because he was such a, he and Angela, you know, were close comrades. We always love Angela. But I think he goes too far. Is that, you think I'm being fair? We've got certain.
He's a great writer, though.
No, he's a great writer. But I mean, it's like Dalits in India. I mean, good God, Ambedkar and others trying to deal with Brahmin hegemony, even in a capitalist India. So we have to be able to be open about these kind of things, even as we recognize, in the end, it's got to be conditions under which we're able to come together with that kind of jazz-like tension, not flat unanimity. See, so I don't agree with Bernie on every issue. At all. We fight over BDS. We've had fights over BDS. And we go back and forth on this in terms of the boycott sanctions and divestments in Palestine and so forth and so on. You see?
Police.
And we can agree to disagree. And I think I'm right. He thinks he's right. I think he's wrong. He thinks I'm wrong.
No, you're right.
Well,
I got it. High decision.
He's still my brother, my comrade, my brother who I'm taking that bullet on the side for. But we got a number of different disagreements on that regard. And I'm just saying that just as a way of being open to the kind of jazz-like conversation and dialogue that's required in the solidarity in which we achieving and trying to aspire to.
Panelists, thank you so much. This has been an incredible conversation, and we'd love to open it up to get maybe 1 or 2 questions from the audience.
As many as, I mean.
As many as people would like.
There was a full-on occupation.
Yeah.
Right here.
I got the idea from the left side, by the way.
I heard it in a few
usual.
minutes. I just crawled
anyway.
over.
Hi, my name is Priya. I'm a student here at Harvard College, and I'm an organizer for the Reproductive Justice and Action Dialogue Collective. Thank you so much for saying what you did at the end. It makes a lot of sense to me that you're on the Planned Parenthood Action Board.
And not at the same time, yeah.
Yeah, honestly. And also just like, I won't take too much time thanking you all, but I'm like a little nervous to be up here, and not because I'm in the presence of greatness, which I am, all 6 of you, but I feel like a radical goodness almost, and from like Piper and Christian especially, and that and what you're saying is rooted in deep, deep empathy and love, and the first thing you said was something like moms are special, right? And those of us who fight for reproductive justice have known this for a long, long time. And you've all talked about things like, You've talked about how love has to be at the center of this revolution, and that comes from a place of identity politics, in my opinion. And so when I came in here and I went and sat in the back and I looked around, immediately I was struck by who is in the center of this room, and where, honestly, the Black and brown and indigenous women are, and where people are positioned in relation to their color and their gender and their sexuality in this room. And I was honestly kind of scared to come up here because immediately people started breaking down identity politics. I'm sorry, I'm like shaking a little bit, which I think also says volumes, right? I'm scared to say this in a room full of Bernie supporters that is predominantly white, and I think that pushes us to question the type of politics that we are creating in the room. And in that last panel, I loved everything you all said. It was so incredible, especially in terms of mainstream media, but for white women, or for white presenting women, right? Where are the women of color? Thank you so much. And like, you're the first person, or the 4 of you are the only time I've heard about this in an international global context. And I think that's what Bernie's campaign ought to look like, right? The integration of, I'm going to turn this into a question. How do you think we can integrate the ideologies that you're talking about based on Audre Lorde's, we can learn to mother ourselves. There's no single issue solution because we're not single issue individuals. How do we translate that ideology into a space that sometimes often seems like class action is the single issue that we're focused on? Even if it's dominant, it seems to me that identity politics, the way they were meant to happen, has to be the center of this revolution. So how do we reconcile the two when the anti-neoliberalist sentiment is anti-identity politics?
I come out of a Black liberation struggle. I helped to co-found an organization called Dream Defenders in 2012, and we've been through a whole lot of stuff, and I've read and I've witnessed, and at the end of the day, I'm an organizer, and so that's my default. That's where I always land. And I was just in Iowa, and in a number of larger rooms that looked and resembled like the one we're in right now. And, you know, you're taken aback by it almost immediately, me coming from where I come from and me being there. For me, I think it is in the way that we organize and in the way that we are really building our organizations, right? We've got to admit, you know, this is on a Tuesday evening at Harvard, and we are going to inevitably get the people who are in this room who can be on a Tuesday night at Harvard in this room. And so I think, you know, for us, if we're going to emanate from that place, we've got to go back to the who, what, when, where, and why. You know, this event could and should be somewhere else, right? And it's going to take organizers, and I say this wherever I go, to the organizers for Bernie. It's going to take you all going into places that, quite frankly, you're probably a little scared of right now. I'm not going to be able to go to the barbershops all over Cambridge like I'm doing in other places with the campaign with Brother West and other people and bringing them into the conversation in a way that they haven't. And so I think if we want to build the powerful thing that reflects the policies that we're putting forward, we're going to have to really, really branch out and organize and put place. It sounds really simple and cliche, but in order for it to happen, it's going to have to be made to happen, and we're going to have to go into places that we're scared to go. We're going to have to listen. We're going to have to teach. We're going to have to take time. And we're going to have to bring people into these places in a way that they haven't. And maybe an event on a Tuesday isn't where we're going to get the type of folks that we want because they're working. They don't have time. They don't follow none of us on Twitter. They don't feel welcome in this institution or maybe even in this city or surrounding areas. And so those are the things that we're going to have to engage with. We talked about this earlier. We can't say that this is about a movement and it's about all of us and still behave fully as an electoral engine, though that is what we are going to do this year. We have to be looking at the next 20, 30 generations of the left and building an organization that's ready to engage with what that looks like. And so we've got to be brave now. We've got to be courageous now. We've got to be afraid now and go beyond our networks in order to build the organizations that's going to actually be able to move the policies that we're talking about. I'm sorry, that's all I got.
I mean, the question that you raised is raised at almost every gathering of progressives, you know, because the country is so rooted in white supremacy and male supremacy. These things don't change overnight. We know that. Same is true with the new immigrants who arrived after 1965. As a result of white supremacist immigration pushed back as a result of the Black Freedom Movement. They come from everywhere now. So that you're absolutely, but one of the ways you do it is yourself raising your voice, making sure you begin to shape the destiny of the Bernie campaign, of the social movement itself, and making sure wherever you go, no matter what color the people are, that you're honest about your version. You're anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic. You're not going to put up with any kind of hatred of Jews and Palestinians and Arabs. You're not going to have it. But that doesn't mean you're going to be a majority voice, because a whole lot of different kind of people in the room. But you're being explicit about that. And so it becomes integral to how you proceed, because you and I know in the end it's not going to be a question of skin pigmentation. That is not what goes into spiritual and moral and political formation. We take John Brown over Clarence Thomas any day, right?
And Candace
Something else is going on. Something else is going on. It's true. We take Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel over Henry Kissinger. Thank you. You got two Jewish brothers, one's a gangster, one's fighting against gangsterism on the domestic front. So that in that sense, it's the quality of the person, the quality of the movement, and the voices of like yourself and others that come together and say, we're going to hit this thing head on. But in a movement, you don't have one person dictating like the police. No, it's got to be shaped in the whole culture of the movement. And Bernie's just been at this now 5 years. 10 years ago, how many people even knew Bernie Sanders? You had to hang out in Burlington, Vermont. And socialist circles even know who he was. Is that fair?
Of course.
Absolutely. So look at what has happened, that he didn't do that on his own. It was Occupy. It was a whole host of movements and forces at work that threw him out. And he happens to be this unprecedented presidential candidate in the history of the nation that can actually provide the kind of movement for poor and working people.
Threw him out of the food co-op.
Just unleashed.
Can I speak real quick more precisely? For the students for Bernie and people who claim Bernie, if the importance of somebody is based on the van or your canvas, do you know what the van is? Okay, y'all that canvas know what the van is. It's the way the Democratic Party provides a list of people with whom you are to engage, who are important, how important they are, how frequently they engage. If that is the metric by which you are deciding what doors you knock on, what conversations you have, where you go, we will fall short of our goal. That's what I mean.
We apologize to everyone sitting in line. We're just going to take one last question from the man on the right.
That's a lot of pressure. All right. First of all, first thing, Dr. West, I just want to say I loved you in The Matrix. Second thing, that's the first time I saw you. All right. And the second thing I want to say is, so back in 2015 when I entered grad school, I was mad at Dr. West because I had just read a piece called The Ghost of Cornel West from Michael Eric Dyson. And it was a hit piece. It was horrible thing to look at this point, because now we see you fighting for Medicare for all and fighting for education for all, while the other person is trying to party with Jay-Z. And so my question is for folks who are still trying to figure out what the hell is politics and trying to figure out just how to make it on a day-to-day basis. What type of metrics should we use to sort of separate the folks who are just full of rhetoric and the people who are full of substance?
May I just be really honest really quickly, and then, of course, Dr. West? I'm trying to party with Jay-Z.
After the cab
and
situation,
everybody
man.
should know that. Nas first, though.
No, I think that anytime you try to do the best that you can do, you get ready to get hit, and you got to get your rope-a-dope in place. My dear brother, he's my student, and so forth and so on, and he had to hit as he was tied to the neoliberal Obama and the neoliberal Biden and a whole host of other issues, including the Middle East. I love my brother. I have to tell him he's wrong as he can be, and just go on and get paid and live his life. But that's not me. You see, that's not me. See, I still love him, but I just love him as a human being.
So no bullets, no bullets,
no bullets. Out on me, I'm gonna say you're a sellout, because I believe that language is actually applicable for so many of our professionals who are willing to almost sell their souls for messes of pottage overnight, just dangle enough status and money and position for them. And they turn their backs on poor and working people. And there's a whole wave, it's a whole subculture of saying that's what it is to be successful. And I reject that kind of peacock-like culture where you walk around, everybody got to look at you, how smart you and how rich you are, and so forth and so on. They said, no, peacocks strut because they can't fly. We need movements where we flying as we connected to the least of these, the most vulnerable, the poor, no matter what color. And so when you read that piece, it was popular for a few months or so, then people began to do research on him and said, fine. But we always invite him back because conversion is always possible.
I remember reading that piece and talking about it with friends and other people. And I would always say, it's a little embarrassing to stand here, but I would just say the simple question was, okay, you can find foibles for any human being on the planet, including Dr. West, right? But what did he do other than say he doesn't want policies that favor drones and Wall Street? Just simplify it. What did the man do? He said that a policy set, a moral vision that I've been holding my whole life is not being followed by this administration, so I'm going to speak on it. That's it. So what is the problem? And I have to say, and I think this is another way in which some of even, I don't want to get into the identity stuff one way or another as a straight white Bernie bro. But some of the conversation that gets slotted in that category is really just toxicity that has nothing to do with the specific set of politics one way or another. And that's something that I wanted to be much more attentive to, including in my own work and how I talk about people and how I think about things. And so, it was, and even I had peers, one really good friend of mine, he said, man, Cornel West is a hater. And all
I do hate injustice. I do hate injustice.
And you know what?
They got me right.
That's right.
Oh, they got me right.
That's right.
Oh, yeah. I hate occupation. That's right. I hate exploitation.
And then,
oh, yeah, I'm a hater, and that's it.
And then 6 months ago, we're in a conversation, we're recording something. He said, did you hear that Mehdi Hassan interview with Cornel West? I said, yeah. He said, Mike, he's the best in the game. But I think there is something about looking at the consistency and the core and the grappling, and then you can measure people by that. And then, yes, you can, and then when there is a pile on, or there is a stupid argument, or somebody is being, you can look at it and say, it's like in Bolivia right now, it's taken on a much bigger level. It's a coup. Do you want to say, like, oh, I don't know, it's complicated, and then in 4 years go, I just watched a Netflix documentary. That was terrible. Or do you want to say, it's a coup. Now.
All right, everyone. I think for the purpose of time, we have to wrap up this incredible conversation. But thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thank you to the wonderful people who gave us questions. And now we'll ask Richie to come back up. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming to our first annual leftist conference at Harvard. This is history in the making, all right? And I know a couple of people have said, you know, oh, this shouldn't be the place to have these types of conversations. These conversations need to happen everywhere, okay? So thank you to all our panelists. You know, round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much. And if you were so inspired by what you heard tonight, it doesn't end here. Tomorrow we have a kickoff meeting from 5 to 7 p.m. at the Harvard Kennedy School. Please be there if you want to continue these types of conversations and continue your activism here at Harvard. We also have a phone bank coming up on Thursday, and next Monday we'll be watching the results of the Iowa caucus. Thank you so much, everyone. Get home safe.